Salutations, my name is Kevin Garcia. I am going to introduce us real quick. This is going to be the Comics in the Classroom panel. We had a separate panel last year. I think this could become a tradition. I've kind of enjoying this, bringing in different people each time to talk about how comic books can be incorporated into education and vice versa. To do that, however, I'd like to introduce ourselves, and starting off with Rick in the corner. Rick Brooks, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Rick Brooks, and do I need to
be near it?
Or use my coach's voice?
Well, in case there are some hearing impairment.
There you go.
And also if they're recording.
Yeah.
And I am an art teacher at a middle school in San Antonio, Texas. I've been doing this for 38 years, so I've been at it for a while. I also am a cartoonist, something I've been doing since I was a kid. Freelance stuff, a lot of indie publishers, some work for some newspapers. Currently I do a self-syndicated comic strip that appears in 6 weekly papers.
By the way, I love that you say cartoonist. I've heard some people say they don't want to use that term because they feel it feels childish, and other people say no, embrace it. Out of curiosity, what do you think about the term cartoonist versus artist or something else?
I didn't even think about it, Kevin. I just came I don't think there's anything wrong with saying cartoonist, and I think that I remember when I was a kid, my dad told me that he thought the best cartoonist in the world was Norman Rockwell, because he's doing what a cartoonist does. He's telling a little story in a picture.
Yeah. I mean, I know that anytime anyone asks me, like, what do you do? I say I'm a cartoonist. But I think it's a little more all-encompassing to use cartoonist instead of like illustrator, because I don't really do, like prints or covers or anything. I just do comics, So whenever I think about cartooning, I think sequential storytelling via art.
Yeah. All right, and Ben Humeniuk.
Hi. So I'm Ben, I'm from Houston. I'm not a smoker, I just have a cold, though I don't condemn people who smoke, that's fine. But I'm a high school English teacher and also an ESL teacher for the first time this year. So I'm getting to work with international students, and man, seeing how they gravitate towards comics is really pretty insightful and eye-opening. I also create comics of my own. I've got a graphic novel, it's kind of a fantasy middle grade piece called Waking Life. It's out through Comic Press from Minnesota. And I just finished a 4-book STEM educational series called Magnificent Makers. And that's from a school library publisher called Rosen Press out of New York. And a lot of the stuff that I understand from comics comes from a guy named Frank Santoro, who, raise your hand if you've ever heard of Comics Workbook or Frank Santoro or any of that stuff. His school thought out of Pittsburgh is really influential in terms of like community form and commodity form kind of coming together. So that's a lot of the stuff that I'd like to talk about today, but more on that in a minute.
All right, and then Steenz.
Hi, my name is Steenz. I am a cartoonist and an editor and a professor of cartooning at Webster University. I did the book Archival Quality from Oni Press, which won the Dwayne McDuffy Award this year. And I did a lot of editorial actually, but one of the biggest things is Rolled and Told, which is the gaming magazine for new and old players alike.
So you won, you got both the Dwayne McDuffy Award and also an Eisner Award, correct?
Yeah, so the anthology that I was in, Elements Fire, that won an Eisner as well as an Ignatz.
And so basically you got a bunch of awards. I felt I felt kind of like insecure about that, so I put that I got a Conan O'Brien Audiencey Award once, which I feel should count. So he just picks random people in the audience and says you get an award, so I own that.
Well, what's really cool about the Ignatz is that, a lot of times whenever you do an anthology series, it's the editor who gets the award. When it's a group project, everyone participated in it. So one of the editors of Elements and Fire, Shingyan Kaur, she actually took the Ignatz, which is a brick, and she took a sledgehammer to it. And she broke it into pieces and put it on individual triangular wooden plaques with our names on it. So we each have a piece of the Ignatz now.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we're trying to, I think she's still trying to figure out how exactly to melt down an Eisner so that we can figure out how to separate that out.
I think that works really well with the Ignatz. Anybody who's not familiar with the Ignatz, it's a award for indie creators especially, but It is named after, what's the name of the comic?
Crazy Cat.
Crazy Cat. I don't know why I was thinking something else cat. But Crazy Cat, who was famously had a brick lobbed at him on a regular basis by a very particular mouse. My name is Kevin Garcia. I am also a high school teacher. I've been teaching for about 15 years now. I also am a contributor to the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which basically means I can say I've been paid to read comic books, which is fun to say. I've been a journalist for about 20 years, but I have not published fiction like these guys have. However, I have been a big proponent of bringing comics into the classroom. I remember when I first started teaching, I actually had to fight with some administrators about being able to do that because they didn't think there was a reason for it. And then a few years later, it was just a big push from the state saying, hey, there needs to be more comics in the classroom. So it's kind of like, see? On that note, I wanted to talk about some of the suggested comics that we had. So these were comics that I asked all the panelists here, what are some of the things that you would suggest? I just picked a few at random, basically, that each put up. One of the ones that's suggested almost constantly is Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Anybody want to tell me about that, who may have suggested that one?
We all kind of gave our seal of approval on that one. How many people have heard of Understanding Comics? Okay, so everyone. So do we really need to talk about it?
Let's pretend there's at least one person here who's not heard of it.
Understanding Comics is by Scott McCloud. It is a fantastic book on absolutely everything comics. I mean, I use it specifically in my cartooning course because it talks about the basics of comics. Everything from different types of word and art combinations to panel transitions to why we draw ourselves with two dots in a mouth for our faces, So it really, really gets to the nitty-gritty of comic creation, and I highly recommend it, not just for teaching comics, but if you want to create comics yourself, I think it's very important for you to at least skim through it.
And I think it's a crucial piece for your aspiring creators, the students that you may be working with, or the young readers that you know, if they want to make this stuff. I found Understanding Comics in the university library at a time when I was hiding Spider-Man comics in my backpack because I was afraid girls would not date me. And it gave so much legitimacy to the idea that this medium has stories to tell beyond what you may see, as Rick was talking earlier, like on a multiplex screen. So that it can be a powerful piece of identity. And I think in many cases, if you're teaching high school level students, they're ready for this book. Like they can take it and demolish it easy.
And I think Steenz was suggesting, and I would agree that there are things that to some of us it's just intuitive, and it's not always intuitive to our students. I know I've done projects in the past with my kids, and I'll look at their finished product and go, why did you put the word balloon here, and then this one here was supposed to happen first, and why is the panel? They're just not familiar with the medium, and so this is a good way of demonstrating things that we take for granted.
And then sometimes, even if you're not used to, visual literacy in general, sometimes you'll still look at a comic and know how to read it, And so understanding comics is a really great way for you to understand why is it that I understand how to read this comic, What is it about the way these panels are put on the page? What is it about this word, this typeface choice? All of that, sometimes it just comes naturally to people, especially nowadays when there are Gen Zers who know absolutely everything about technology and visual literacy, and this really kind of goes back to, but I understand you know it, but let's talk about why you know it.
You mentioned that sometimes we need to know how to read a comic book. I've actually had students tell me when I would introduce comics as part of a lesson, flat out, I don't know, I've never read one before, I don't know what direction to read, I don't know how to read it. And it's kind of funny to have a handy guide of literally, here is how to read comics. Also, whenever I've had teachers ask me, well, what's something that I should introduce before doing a section on comics, I usually say Understanding Comics, or at least something from it. Tied to that, though, I think, Rick, you had suggested Making Comics, one of the sequels? No, somebody had suggested Making
Possibly. I know I had Scott McCloud on my list. I don't remember which.
Well, he's got a series of books. He's got Making Comics, Understanding Comics, Reinventing Comics. He basically single-handedly pushed to get comics recognized as a literature genre. And not genre, that's the wrong term for it, but just as literature, basically.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because all of those books, and I've gone through all of those books, and they are supremely helpful. But they don't tell you exactly how to make something good. You know, it'll show you how to make it, but is it something that people will buy? You know, this may be an incredibly, you know, well-drafted illustration, but if the story isn't good, you know, people probably won't buy it, which I think is very interesting because I think Scott McCloud is a horrible writer. I don't like any of his books except for his understanding and reinventing comics. Like The Sculptor, don't read it, it's crap.
I think there's something in seeing noble failures, and maybe I'll at least give Sculpture that much credit, but it's nothing compared to the New Adventures of Abraham Lincoln, which was a way early experiment in computer-generated comics fusion. And if you can track that down on Amazon, it is a site worth observing.
So I had on my list one of the books that's considered to be a standard whenever there's comics in the classroom, and that's Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I notice a lot of times when I ask people to recommend comics, they leave out the really obvious ones because they're so obvious. But the thing is, they may be obvious to us that have been, you know, versed in comics lore, but for those that are new to it, they don't understand it. Mouse, for those of you guys who aren't aware, is the true story of Nazi cats versus Jewish mice. Because it is Art Spiegelman listening to his father telling the story of the Holocaust and his survival, but he presents it all through these kind of anthropomorphic figures where each ethnic group is represented by a particular animal. You know, so the Jews are mice, and the Nazis are cats, and the Americans are dogs. Apparently, according to Art Spiegelman, he randomly picked pigs for the Poles, but that got him banned from Poland for a few years. So,
Charged imagery.
One thing, that's the thing though, I will say that about charged imagery, is that the book is very, very intense, and I find it to be intense in ways that aren't expected. I mean, because you're already, you know, thinking, okay, the Holocaust, it's going to go some dark places. But it's the parts of the book that are in the present day of the 1970s that deals with the family traumas that I was not expecting going in. I found those to be very, very intensely personal. Have any of you guys ever used Mouse either or recommended it in class or anything like that?
With freshmen, I have not yet. I think
I've used it with seniors. So
with seniors, yeah. I think a more mature student is probably necessary to read the book, partially because of the way it's set up with the memoir weaving in and out of Spiegelman's dad and Spiegelman. So you've got to make sure the kids are ready for it. But also, I mean, our kids love reading about World War II and the Holocaust. That's a frequented section in my classroom in my library. So maybe I'm not giving them enough credit.
You can get a high-end seventh grader when they do the Diary of Anne Frank, and they want something more. Pull it off the bookshelf and hand it to them, and they will read it up.
He was just saying, if you have somebody even as low as 7th or 8th grade that is really high end, they will enjoy it if they've already read something similar. I've actually done that as well. I've had several people who would read Eli Wiesel, what's the Night. Thank you. For some reason I was thinking of every other one-syllable word I could think of, and that wasn't Night. And I've recommended, you know, so you loved that book, try this, and I have done that myself.
What's interesting about Mouse, though, is that using these anthropomorphic figures definitely makes it a little more accessible. I have found that a lot of times when I'm talking to friends of color who or always feel like a connection to certain cartoon characters, oftentimes it's animals because they don't see themselves as people. You know, a lot of times you'll see cartoonists and they're white, you know? So I often find that a lot of times if you're a person of color, you can't find something to relate to, oftentimes animals kind of take that place. But also what I like about Mouse is that it's cute, you know, and it talks about something really intense, the Holocaust, you know. And in my work in particular, like, I want to be able to tell horror stories and things that, you know, stick with people and scare them and give them nightmares, but my kind of style is cute, you know. So I like that I can have that juxtaposition, and it's good to see that it can be done in not just horror, but also memoirs and history and so on and so forth.
And on that note of changing styles, I have this one as one of our recommended. I moved to Los Angeles to work in animation, and I just love when they have giant titles like that. I think it's a lot of fun. So what is I moved to Los Angeles to work in animation?
That is an incredible book. So I have no interest in working in animation, even though all of my students are animation students. But I moved to Los Angeles to work in animation. It's basically a memoir about this young woman who literally did that. And it tells you everything. I mean, it tells you everything from how it's going to be hard when you get there because it's really expensive to move to Los Angeles, and how there are some studios that are with a union and some that are not, and different ways that you can get paid and different ways that you can take classes on how to get better at storyboarding and get better at learning the craft, and how to get into meeting other people who also work in animation. I mean, pretty much anything that you can think of when it comes to being a part of an industry is in that book, and it's done in such a clear and concise way that I think graphic novels is a great medium for, because it, you see how she feels, you can see it on her face that it is difficult when you make a big jump like that. But also, I don't know, there's something about graphic novels that makes it a lot easier for people to have that connection to the person when it comes to memoirs. And I moved to Los Angeles to work in animation. It's definitely really good for that. And like I said, I have no interest in working in animation, but I learned a lot from it. And it's very interesting. And I think anyone who is interested in, taking a leap of faith and getting into an entirely new industry should read the book.
I hadn't heard of this one before you had suggested it, so I went to go look into it, and the art style, it just really appeals to me. The artist, Natalie Nurigat, what's interesting is that, like with most comics, she puts outlines for all the characters and the objects and the things in the frame, but the frame itself has no border. None of the word balloons have borders, and then there's actual sound effects and word balloons that'll go across the page that just has a very, with kind of pastel color scheme, has a very soothing appeal to it, very, very unified. I love being able to show students that there's so many different styles of comic. Usually I have kids come in knowing one of three things: never read a comic, seen them in newspapers, or heard of superheroes, or manga. And it's good to have alternate takes. One that was recommended a lot was American Born Chinese. You want to talk about that a little bit?
I think there's a lot of meat on this one. How many of you have already read it? American Born Chinese, Gene Yang. Or if you've read one of Gene Yang's works in general, kind of be honest. It was one of the first, I think, was it the first to be nominated for the Young People's version of the National Book Award? Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah, so it's got some of that heft behind it. Yang himself has been an ambassador for young people's literature. He got nominated again for Boxers and Saints. But this is a great one, and one that I'm going to be using with my ESL students this next semester, because it's 3 interlocking stories of people trying to find their identity in a new culture. And on one hand, one of the characters initially appears to be a white boy. You find out there's more to his story that involves blending in and kind of coding himself that can create empathy for people coming from other cultures that don't seem to be dominated by your country. So it's got a lot of sociological meat on it, like we've talked about with some of these other comics. It's also just got disarming, cute cartooning. And it's got some great moments your teens are going to love, like, what do I put on? How do I fix my hair? How does this stuff go horribly wrong? We've got jokes where an anthropomorphic monkey pees on the hand of a god and gets in trouble for it. So there's a lot to appeal it to your readers of different types, and it's, again, very approachable in that regard and good for conversation.
Also, what's very interesting about this book, so a friend of mine, Wendy Chu, she actually teaches creative writing at her, I think it's specifically for Asian Americans, and one of the first things that she showed them was American Born Chinese, because she was like, this is the shit, and this is something that she grew up reading, and this is something that really appealed to her, and she found that some of her students were just like, it's not my thing. And I think it's really interesting, and it's really important for us as educators to keep a good eye on things that are changing, So yes, this may be an incredible book, but as time moves on, there may be other books that appeal to Asian Americans or any kind of, person of color that may work better just because we've moved on now, So very interesting.
For many years I taught on the border, and I had many of my students that were either first generation or second generation, and mostly from Mexico. And the idea is that although this is not their story, they understood it, they sympathized with it. It opened up the idea that these experiences they were having, they were not alone in, and more importantly, it applies to people from backgrounds other than their own, which a lot of my students it was a literal eye-opener. I could see it in their face when they're saying oh wait, people have had these experiences that are not Hispanic or Latino. So I just think that's amazing. I also had recommended on here Waking Life.
I did not recommend my own book. I didn't do that. That was somebody else.
That being said, I do want to talk about it for a second, though, because this book is purposefully, as you said earlier, calling back to Norman McKay's Little Nemo, which to me is one of the foundations. Whenever I talk about comics as literature, I want to get into the history of it, and to me that involves getting the history of some of the artists that were decades ahead of their time. And if you ever look up Little Nemo, the original comic strips from the 20s, the art in there is just, he's doing things with art that people wouldn't be doing again until probably, by comic art, I mean, they just kept defining things, I guess. That people wouldn't be doing again until the 60s and 70s, really pushing things decades ahead of its time. And he was even doing early animation too, which is pretty neat. So just that by itself, that history of it, that it has a modern story that I can use as a gateway to, while we're at it, let's talk about, these older comics.
Well, come see me at table 2 when we're done. I'll talk to you more about that one. I'd also say this. I like showing my students Waking Life because it's the first graphic novel I published at length, and it's very rough. Like, I look at the work I'm making now and I say, oh, this is my awkward high school yearbook. I think it's good to share your failures with your students and to show where your process gets modified and how you grow. I think that's something that we as educators probably agree is a big part of our practice and our craft. I'm going to give them courage to make their own mistakes too so they can continue in their growth process. But it's a good book, come see it.
Here's one that I recommend that other people don't think about. I always have to say this as a confession. I'm not a humongous fan of manga and anime, and for a lot of my students that's like a stab to the heart. But there is one manga that I believe everyone in the world should read, and it's called Yotsuba, and that's how I pronounce it. It's Yotsuba, ampersand, exclamation point, so you have to say it. But it's about a 4-year-old girl, give or take, that spent her first couple years living on an island alone with her dad, moved to Japan, and so now everything is new to her and everything's exciting. So every issue is like, what is that? And they're like, it's an air conditioner. What's it do? And it's just everything through her eyes is amazing. And so a lot of it is just learning about society and culture, but other things are more specifically about Japanese culture. And it's just, I just find it to be a beautiful book, but I've also used it a lot for English language learners, because there's very simple dialogue in it, because everything has to be explained to Yotsuba, then everything is also being explained to the reader. So that made it very, very easy for students that are transitioning into English to be able to have, here's a manga that is not written down to them, it's not written for little kids, but it explains everything as it's going. Like, what's a cicada? Okay, let's explain that. So everything is in there. So that makes it so approachable. The one hard downside is that I'm dealing with people that have, I was dealing with people that struggle with reading, and because it's a manga, you have to read backwards. But once we get over that hurdle, we're fine. Any of you guys ever try manga for educational purposes? That you introduce it in the classroom for certain things?
So it's interesting, when I actually started teaching, one of my first questions was, what are you guys reading? And most of my students are reading manga, or they're reading stuff on Webtoon or Tapas. And both of those are traditionally Korean comics, and just the idea of Webtoons and Tapas and how it works with its vertical scrolling and its storytelling is fascinating, because it's a completely different style of sequential art. So I find that a lot of people, younger readers currently, are reading that, and I think it's because of the accessibility. Like, you can just get it on your phone, so you don't have to go to a comic shop or a bookstore. You can just download the app, and all of your comics are right there. But I think the one thing that is different about manga versus American comics is the humor is a little different. And I find that in my students' comics, they all have a very kind of manga style of humor. So they're definitely picking up on what they're reading, and that's what they end up creating.
Yeah, cross-cultural humor is always interesting. We're going to be there's going to be a Latinx panel tomorrow with Latina discussion about creators and comics and stuff. And I was talking to one of the people that's going to be there tomorrow, and one of the big things is looking back at some of the comics he grew up with. He's looking back, and there's culturally very different from the humor we have here, and that's going to happen no matter where you go from. So the idea of exposing kids to like different cultural norms is exciting.
Plus, there's the whole theory of we've got a generation of manga readers that are going to be next comics creators, and what does that do for medium? What does that do to our sense of humor? culturally, if you think about how Japan has kind of imported something that is drastically changing American reading habits, and in the case of anime viewing habits, how many of you have streamed an anime series within the past year through some sort of platform or service? Can anyone talk to that? I tried Cowboy Bebop for the first time this year, and then I was like, okay, I'm ready for Evangelion.
Yeah.
But those were great. There's no way ready for Evangelion, but it's a thing. Bookscan numbers came out recently. They talked about it at New York Comic Con this past week. Manga is the second largest category of comic-oriented books sold in the US after YA-style graphic novels. It deeply eclipses superhero comics. And I think, as Steenz pointed out earlier, talking about American-born Chinese, if we stay stuck in reading habits that we ourselves have nurtured and we're not identifying what our kids are into, as with our manga reading students, we're going to miss the boat. So we kind of owe it to them to be familiar with the stuff they're reading and how they're enjoying it.
Go check out Fooly Cooly. It's only 6 episodes long. You'll get something out of it.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, my husband is a comic shop manager, and the majority of the comics that he reads is X-Men, of course, because it's great.
Hoxpox was
Yeah,
good deal.
don't even talk to me about Hoxpox.
Okay.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And manga. I mean, our bookshelves are overflowing with manga, and he's finding that it is more helpful to him to, not just because he likes it, but because his customer base is just, they're more interested in manga these days. So I'd be interested to see what a lot of these comic shops look like in the next 10 years. I think similar to libraries, it changes with society, you know? So comic shops that used to just be, you know, single issue comics, back issues, hole in the wall, and then now it's growing into graphic novels and gaming and community building. So I'm interested to see where manga fits in, because, you know, it did have a large portion of real estate back in, you know, the early 2000s with Tokyo Pop. So to see where it's going now, it should be interesting to see where that goes.
Like, oh, manga. Like,
Yeah.
what's all this shoujo stuff coming over here? Magical Girl.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's like similar with strip comics too. One of the strip comics that I think is gaining popularity again is Nancy.
Yeah.
It is hilarious, and I use it in my classroom to talk about 4-panel comics and figuring out the 3-act structure. And Nancy is it's something that is using the kind of humor that this generation of readers gravitates to, and combining it with the traditional style of comic strip art.
Like you mentioned, Nancy, my favorite area of comics is like the older, earlier eras, and I like Nancy and Lulu are both coming back and getting a resurgence. On the opposite end from traditional manga, somebody recommended The Arrival by Shantan.
Yeah.
I don't know this one very well, but just the art alone is amazing. Somebody want to tell me about this?
Yeah. Well, before, you look like you were about to say something about strip comics. You want to add something?
No, it was on manga, but
Oh, okay.
we'll move beyond that.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure you had a chance to talk. Yeah, The Arrival is sick. It is a wordless graphic novel about a man who moves to a new country, and his experience trying to figure it out. What's great is that it is visual literacy at its finest. It is like concentrated, densely visual literacy, because nothing in this world / country is real. Like you don't see, this is like, he doesn't move to New York, he doesn't move to Chicago, he moves to this fantasy place. But the world is so well formed and the storytelling is so well done that anyone can read it. And I mean, do you guys know what visual literacy is for the most part? Yeah, so it's gaining meaning from not words but from images. And The Arrival is the one graphic novel that absolutely teaches that.
Again, I've found this is really successful with ELLs. Because again, it's a story about I'm arriving in a new place, I've got culture shock, I've got to orient. One of the ways the main character becomes successful in his new country is he hears other people's stories. And we actually have flashbacks to the narratives of other people in the tale. Has anyone successfully used The Arrival with students or young readers in your life? Has anyone tried it before? I would almost guarantee your local library's got it, probably your school library's got it as well. If you're struggling readers, ones who won't pick up a book for choice for nothing, put this in front of them, their eyes will light up. Also along these lines in a different book is Jason Shiggett's Meanwhile. If you're not familiar with that, it is a game in the form of a book. It's a choose your own adventure that you have to track over multiple pages. There are codes, you have to beat it, and you have to actually cheat to beat the book. So these are two that I found that my students who really don't like reading will start to use as an inlet into reading. And maybe this sits on a broad theme, I'm just going to propose this and you guys tell me if I'm wrong. I think comics work best with students as vehicles for empathy and for building confidence as readers. I think that is the ground level reason that you can defend these to administrators in any sort of situation. And the more in tune with the empathy they build or the confidence they create, I think the more useful we're going to be as educators putting these in people's hands.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. I think what's specifically nice about, graphic novels is that you can linger on a page, and you can look at the artwork and try and figure out what exactly is going on in this scene. Unlike movies, if you see a scene and you want to go back to it, you have to rewind, you have to pause, and then you end up with a screen where their face is moving over their face, and it's just it's not the same. But with graphic novels, and really most books, but graphic novels especially because of the visual aspect of it, it's something that you can take your time with. And I know that a lot of readers, I know for me especially, I want to take my time with things because sometimes it's hard to understand what the story is actually trying to tell me if I'm speeding through it,
Yeah, the fact that you can control the pace of the experience puts a lot of power in the reader's hands.
Mm-hmm.
That's a solid thing.
I
think we've got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Have you used things like Hugo or Wonder? Again, wordless, sequential stories.
Fair question.
Done in a very, it's a finite style, but have you used those too with that ESL, ELL population?
That's a fair point. I haven't directly taught Hugo in my class, but I've got it on my shelf for that reason.
See, I've got a copy of Wonder for the same reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And Wonder's great because of the empathy that builds, especially from triangulating perspective. So I think those are both very good points and probably worth adding to your list. If you're building a list of materials to use with your students, how many of you came here explicitly to get some ideas on comics you could use with young readers that you're working with? Is that anybody? Okay, so some of these ideas we're building, definitely Wonder, Hugo, if he wants to add to that. And I think, is it possible to get this material online after we're done?
Yeah, actually, there is last year's version of the PowerPoint is already on the Staple website, but we're going to add it, this one up probably by the end of the weekend, hopefully by tomorrow, but I know Chris is pretty busy, but we'll get to that.
All the recommendations you don't like on there came from Rick Brooks. Sorry, wait, I know you had.
I'm the one that recommended Waking Life.
He was waiting for that opening.
Just got glad on the panel, guys.
Speaking of Rick, you also recommended Rick Batman Year One, and I love when traditional superhero comics. A lot of times, again, we're looking at the artsy literature part, but why can't superhero comics be artsy in literature? So,
yeah, this one it reads like a novel. It is the best Batman movie that never got made. It's the Mazzucchelli's artwork is sublime. I mean, I can find no flaw with it.
No, yeah, agreed.
I love using traditional comics as well because obviously I have a history with it. One that I like to bring up is the Superman comics by Siegel and Shuster, the original ones, especially the daily strips, because the daily strips break everything down. Like what was one page in Action Comics #1 was about 2 or 3 weeks worth of comic strips in the newspaper. So they were able to really expand on it, and I've used that to kind of go back and forth with things that kids are already familiar with, even if they don't read comics, they know who these characters are, and then, build off of that. Also listed here is another one with a nice long title, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me.
I don't remember who suggested it, but...
It was you.
Oh, shit. Well, that's great. Actually, Rosemary is actually here, so if you wanted to go in and pick that up, I highly recommend it. Laura Dean is... So we were talking about how a lot of our students are reading manga and they're being influenced by anime. This is definitely one of those books. It is a traditional graphic novel done by a traditional graphic novelist, and it is in a very manga style. Like, I would almost consider this a manga more than I would consider it a graphic novel. But it's a story about this girl who is in a very bad relationship where Laura Dean keeps breaking up with her, and she doesn't really see her own value. And I think one of the best reasons to teach this comic is the storytelling isn't typical. You know, it goes back and forth. It takes time to breathe, and then it moves through time very quickly. It definitely takes everything that you learn about cartooning and sequential art and puts it all into one book, and it does so incredibly well. And they did, and the book swept at the Ignats this year. I'm pretty sure Rosemary got to the airport and they were like, "What do you have in your bag, bricks?" And she's like, "Yes, 3." So yeah, it's really fantastic. And if you have students that are like, I don't know if I really like comics, I really just like reading manga, show them Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, because I think it's a perfect mix between manga and American style comics.
And as with some of the earlier comics I was talking about, I love when there is a distinct visual style to a book. And again, just with the few pages that I was able to look up as I was going through this, it's got solid black, solid white, solid gray, but then this soft pink that just shows up throughout the book to kind of emphasize, and I just love that idea. Jumping down, also with traditional comics, Ultimate Comics was recommended. Ben?
Yeah. So
Ultimate Spider-Man specifically, sorry.
Ultimate Spider-Man, yeah. Raise your hand if you saw Far From Home this past summer. All right, and if you're relieved that 2 giant mega corporations have agreed to share intellectual property again, right? How weird is that we like are super excited that's happening, but we really are. But it all starts in Ultimate Spider-Man, and I'm convinced Marvel has a blind spot in its publishing program by not recognizing they've got an evergreen YA title that's been around since the early 2000s. Spider-Man's having a hot cultural moment. You've got kids that like this character. If they pick up this book, they're going to see a very Tom Holland-esque version of Spider-Man and a very Zendaya-esque version of Mary Jane, kind of going through life together and facing the highs and lows of high school experience. So this is an easy win. It's an all-time great, and then you get the extra benefit of having Miles Morales come in and take over the storyline down the line. For those of you and your students who love Spider-Verse, right? Like, there's just a lot of ways to connect the pop culture conversation back to this piece.
One thing I love about Ultimate Spider-Man is that because it's an alternate reality, they can do things that aren't done in the regular comics. In this case, that involves spoilers, killing Peter Parker. But
he gets better.
Yeah, it's fine.
but it's such a beautifully done death of storyline that it's just there. I can't say that a comic has really brought me to tears like that, and that one really did do that job. And I didn't read most of Ultimate Spider-Man. I really just read the last chapter of it, and it still got to me. So, one on my list is Persepolis. I don't usually use the whole book, Persepolis, by Marjane Satrapi. But what I'll do is I'll be reading Mouse with the kids, take a break from it for a little bit because it is very intense, and then we'll read some of Satrapi's Persepolis, which is about her childhood growing up in Iran around the time of the revolution. And her family were basically communists, which at that time seemed like a very ideal thing to be. But then when the new government ended up not being what they expected as communists, and ended up being instead a religiously run theocracy, they suddenly became very much unwelcome in their own country. So it was just a very, very intense experience. But what I love about it is, as far away as that is, and I was using this example earlier of my students, as far away as it is from my students' childhood, there are so many things that she does growing up, whether it's like looking for her favorite band or like ignoring her parents or whatever is happening, that they do, that they really connected with her on a personal level. And I just love that idea that, especially when I had students that were unlikely to leave, within 40 miles of their house anytime soon, connect with somebody on the other side of the world. So.
Yeah, I actually have a funny story about this. I was late to reading Persepolis, and I was reading it, and I was going through it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is about the revolution from Iran. And my husband is Persian, and I was like, Kia, did you know this? And he's like, yeah. Yes, I knew this. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the revolution. I was like, oh my God. So I learned a lot about my husband by reading Persepolis. But yeah, one of the things that I do like about Persepolis when it comes to showing it to students is the fact that it's super relatable. And like Persepolis, Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, is exactly the same. She is, different from a lot of the readers, but she's also very, very similar interactions and how she behaves and who she talks to. And, you know, Persepolis, there are parts where it's really funny. And it's the same thing for Miss Marvel. And what I love about Miss Marvel is that, you know, her entire family are Muslim, but they all see Islam in a completely different way, which is very real. I mean, we've all have families that like, oh, we're all raised one certain religion, but everyone's like, I'm like 50%, you know. So the part that is great about these kinds of stories is that it makes it so that you can feel a connection to people that are unlike you, because it's clear we all have the same, you know, problems. We like reading fan fiction, you know.
Yeah. And one last thought on Persepolis. Satrapi's cartooning skills are just, they're admirable in their simplicity. When you pick the book up, you don't think, wow, I'm in the presence of a Da Vinci. You see a Picasso. This is someone who just puts direct marks on a page. So for your students who think comics need to look like they're rendered immaculately with great hatching, Satrapi's a great alternative to that in terms of very simple, direct, and efficient art making.
And with that segue, going from the ultra simplistic Persepolis, the next one I have here listed is Upgrade Soul, which has hyper detail.
Yeah, Upgrade Soul is great. Ezra Clayton Daniels is an incredible, incredible writer and artist, and this book is great for readers who are looking for something scary and sci-fi, but also something that is human and real, and Upgrade Soul is definitely that. Ezra, he always talks about how this book took him like 15 years to make, and I was like, well, don't do that for your next one, because you're running out of time. But it's definitely, it's amazing. It's basically, does anyone know what Upgrade Soul is about? Has anyone heard of it? Okay, great. So Upgrade Soul is about, it's relatively new, so it's not like a classic.
It won the McDuffy Award the year before Archival Quality?
Yes, it did.
Okay,
yeah.
so it's got some buzz here, yeah.
Yeah, it's Eisner and Ignatz nominated. I mean, it's fantastic, but it's about these elderly scientists, and they find a way to preserve their consciousness in younger bodies, and they're like, let's do it. I mean, why not? And so they do it, and things go horribly wrong. They wake up and they can see their bodies next to them, and they're like, oh my God, are we like in the middle of it? What's happening? And they end up being in these almost fetus-like, disgusting bodies. And it's a story about how, you know, you can have some of the greatest minds in the world, and how do they look? You know, so it's about, you know, how do we treat people that look different from us? And it's about what makes us who we are. Is it our bodies? Is it our minds? Is it how we treat people? Because then, once they wake up and they see that they're in these, you know, deformed bodies, their other bodies wake up too. So now there are two of them, and they have to kind of interact with each other. Who is real? Who is actually them? So it's really, really fantastic and frightening and exciting and romantic, and it's everything that I think a graphic novel should be.
I think the love story between the lead characters, Kevin said, I mean, Death of Spider-Man was so well done, it made him tear up. The relationship between the two leads in their original human bodies almost brought me to tears, because there's some real crisis moments they have to face as a septuagenarian couple dealing with these fetus alternative cells. It's almost like someone took an episode of Rick and Morty with all its absurdity and loaded it down with compassion and some really deep, leading-edge sci-fi stuff. And the side characters get really good storylines too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a masterclass of storytelling in every single way. And the idea that, I mean, it makes sense that it took me 15 years to make this book, because it's perfect. You have a question?
Yeah, what was the first one? Upright?
Upgrade Soul by Ezra Clayton Daniels.
And I think we should do this last one, I think, and then we'll get to the other discussion. And this one has been brought up by several people, and that is Bone by Jeff Smith. And why Bone?
Why not?
That is a good answer.
Well, one of the things I find interesting about it is it started out just this really modest independent comic and took off. And somebody, I don't know if it was Jeff Smith himself or someone had the idea to present this thing to Scholastic, and that it the rest is history. I mean, you cannot go to a high school or a middle school or elementary library without seeing this. I mean, I see kids all the time carrying those big bricks of bone around, and I mean, and it's just a heck of a lot of fun. I mean, his art is so clean and pretty, and it's got sometimes it seems like Warner Brothers, and sometimes it seems like Tolkien, and sometimes not. It's just a lot of fun.
And probably your students have read Bone already, so it's a good time for them to read it again, because it's that kind of book.
But look into like the meaning of stuff, especially after looking at something like Understanding Comics.
Sure. Come back to it with a more critical eye.
So I wanted to get into a more general discussion about comics in education now that we've kind of had a little bit of vocabulary put in there. But Ben, you said you might want to talk about something first. You want to talk about, get started in the discussion?
Well, sure. Well, you've come to a panel because you're interested in comics and education with young people, and you've heard us talk to you about our recommendations, but we'd love for you to bring something to the forefront if you would like to, and maybe to connect with some other educators. So I'm going to ask you just to turn and talk real quick, and if you're an educator, this may be a strategy you're familiar with. Would you mind turning to somebody who is not you or somebody you know? Would you introduce yourself? And would you recommend a comic to them that you think would be good for a student? One that's been mentioned or one that maybe has not.
Or ask for a recommendation.
Or ask for a recommendation. We will give you like a genuine 2 minutes to do this, and then I want to hear some of your ideas.
One of my favorite things to do when you're asking for recommendations is to ask someone what do they like to do. Don't ask them what they like to read, because then you might end up giving them something that they've already read. But if you start thinking about what their hobbies are and who they are, or what they're interested in as a person, it may be easier for you to find a recommendation that they may not have thought of before.
We'll give you about 20 more seconds to wrap up your discussion, and we'd love to hear your ideas. 4, 3, 2, and 1.
You can tell the teacher in the room.
You've got to have a respectful signal to bring everybody back in.
So what'd you guys find out about? Out of curiosity, anybody get some really good suggestions? Anybody want to raise a hand and let us know what they were? Nobody got a good suggestion? What'd you get, man?
So we had a conversation about Warren Ellis.
Warren Ellis? I've heard of him.
Talked about Orbiter, which is, a love affair with the space program, and some alternate history type facts. We also talked a little bit about his book called Come In Alone, which is a condensation of his blog, which not all of which is appropriate for kids, but a lot of it is, here's how comics are written. Here's 4-panel, here's 6-panel, and Warren goes into this whole diatribe about why you can break out of that mold, and you can do alternate things and still use the gutter for its purpose. And you can do these things, but you can expand upon your storytelling. So it's not necessarily for your beginner kid, but it is for that kid who they've digested all of this and they want something more. They want to set their teeth into something, so you just go say, here, now read this. And then they have that eye-opening aha moment.
By the way, there's a Warren Ellis book that I think gets overlooked a lot, and I was thinking of it right now when you said it. Anybody here ever read JLA Avengers?
Oh, yeah.
It's a great book. Warren Ellis did one called Ultraforce Avengers rather, and it was a really, really neat take on universes colliding, and it's probably never going to get reprinted because I don't know what's going on with Ultraverse and Marvel, but it was a great book, so seek that out.
Okay.
Any other good suggestions?
I just want to mention I worked at Malibu during the Ultraverse.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, that's never going to get reprinted.
I've heard different rumors as to why. I'd love to hear your version sometime.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other suggestions of things people should read?
All the way back there.
I've just been freaking out about this book every time I read an issue, and it just got printed by Image by Copra.
Oh yeah, the top
It
is
is phenomenal. The artistic style is just very different from what you see. It's ink and the colored pencils, and there's parts and issues where there's no dialogue. It's just thought bubbles of an image. But every time I read that book, I want to yell to everyone around me, you should all be reading this. It's just phenomenal.
That's COPRA. Copra.
If you don't mind running around with a copy of the trade paperback through the stable aisles, let's start here.
I just read the first issue, the image published at the coffee shop before I came here, and I was seriously like, anybody comic book fans?
Not here, though. What do you have about?
I suggested Batman Black and White.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's different takes. My dad.
I'm so proud.
I liked it how it was different takes on the same character.
Yeah.
And that's maybe something interesting to show to a student. Yeah. Although half of them are, have text, half of them don't, and it's just so many different varieties. Here, find your favorite.
I love taking a character that people are already familiar with and then presenting them in entirely new ways. That's what makes it so good.
This is,
All-Star Superman, yeah, it's exactly.
and I think back on Batman Black and White, we haven't talked about many anthologies, but talk about getting kids interested in something to read or getting students like a book with multiple entry points, multiple short stories, that gives a lot of opportunities to connect with something that's very wise.
It also shows that, you can make comics that are short as well. So many times we're in classrooms, you're like, you have to read this giant graphic novel, and you can be an accomplished creator and do just, 6 to 10 page stories. It's also good if you're an editor and looking for new creators, which I use all the time.
A book I have on my shelf at school is it's an anthology, Bizarro Comics.
Yeah.
And DC just hired a bunch of indie creators and said, do whatever you want with our characters. And I keep telling the kids, they're like, well, where do I start? Like, it has a story, but technically just pick a chapter and read that one, because that's all it is.
So do you show kids anything by Mike McDuffy? I mean, you talk about multiple entry points.
Yeah.
You can pull in Hellboy anywhere you want.
I also have Hellboy on my shelf.
Yeah.
Any other suggestions? Anyone else good?
We talked a little bit about Will Eisner's book on making comics, which is really great. Will Eisner is one of the great classic creators. Also, the Secret Protocols of the Elders of Zion might be a really interesting read these days.
Was that his last book?
You mean the Eisner version?
Yeah, the Eisner version.
I was gonna say.
Or the plot, that's what it's called, the plot. But it's essentially a behind the scenes of the conspiracy theory of Jews controlling the media, et cetera, et cetera. And it might be really interesting reading nowadays with the whole fake news, conspiracy theory stuff.
On the off chance that people are not familiar with Eisner, we've mentioned Eisner Awards several times. Will Eisner was kind of one of the early godfathers of comics in the sense of treating them in a serious manner and also going different directions with them. Also one of the first people to get sued for ripping off another character, but that's because his editor specifically told him, draw us your own version of Superman. So, any other suggestions?
We were talking about a couple, I mentioned Day Tripper, which is
Day Tripper.
That was on one of the lists here. I didn't put that one in.
Day Tripper by Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba. It is my favorite graphic novel, hands
I think
down.
they approve of that discussion.
The English department asked if I had a recommendation for a graphic novel, and I said Day Tripper. And the majority of their students now are they're carrying it around all the time.
Casanova.
Can I add that to my thing?
Yeah. It's also interesting if you look at when Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba work together, because they are twins. And a lot of times when artists draw, they kind of draw themselves in everything. You can kind of tell even in my work that oh, okay, you're kind of drawing yourself. So it's really interesting to see the similarities between Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba's artwork because they look the same, It's really interesting.
And one more suggestion.
I don't feature anything, but I think Ramona's pretty solid.
Oh, yeah.
We were kind of talking about how, some comics you can, age up or down. And it's definitely, I think, targeted towards maybe, a high school audience. There is some, some relatively heavy violence in the comic, but because the art style is, cutesy and quite simplistic, it's not graphic. So I think it's something that, middle schoolers could read as well.
Ramona's also good to show that you can take a comic that has been a webcomic and it can be published traditionally as well.
And if you're ever fearful of how is my administration going to receive this book, it was the first comic in America to win the National Book Award. You just get nominated, actually took home the prize. That's a pretty good deal. And if they like She-Ra, you got Stevenson right there making this comic, so it's
Their best job.
And then we mentioned Mouse earlier. That one I think got a Pulitzer. So there's always these. And then was it Watchmen, they got a.
It was Times. It was on Times 100 Best Graphic Novels of the 20th
But
century.
yeah, a lot of comics get awards, and it's great to tell it to administrators. I was saying to move on, but if you want to get one more suggestion?
Oh, so I work mostly with younger kids, more middle school and younger, and one thing I always recommend done is the Zeta the Space Girl series.
Yeah,
Ben Humeniuk. And one of the things that's really helped is I'm trying to teach them, when you tell a story, you don't just lead to the next logical step and then this happened. You have to come up with something crazy. You have to go, but then this happened, but then this happened. And it's something that really helped illustrate that for a lot of the younger kids I was working with.
And this is a good time to support Ben Humeniuk. His daughter was in an accident recently and unfortunately passed away. There's been a fund that's been raised for the family to help pay for funeral expenses, but he's certainly a creator worth your time.
Well, there's one topic that I wanted to talk about, and that's something that I try to bring up every time there's the idea of comics in a classroom discussion, and that is, what can creators do to get their work into classrooms? Obviously, I mean, it always depends on the right person seeing the right book, but any suggestions that you guys would have for things that creators might keep in mind when working on a book? Maybe you're not aiming it at, high school or middle school or whatever, but like whatever you're aiming it at, it could end up in a school,
I actually recommend starting with a library. So I'm a creator, and I was a librarian, and I teach, so I've got fingers in all the pots. But typically, it's relatively easy to get a library to put something into their circulation. So if you have a book and you want to make sure that your book goes into that circulation, just bring it and say, hey, I'd like to donate this book to your library. And once something's in the library, it's a lot easier for an educator to say, oh, well, if you can pick it up in the library, then we can absolutely teach it in the class.
I think too, making contacts with local educators and making yourself available as a resource. Author talks are beneficial. You get a real life person in the room talking about creating a book. That helps kids know, oh my gosh, I can do this too. Even better is doing a workshop, right? Come in and talk about part of the process of making a story. Get kids drawing comics who maybe don't feel like they've got art skills, but see that they can put together 4 panels of a narrative in a very short amount of time. So, and again, it's fairly simple to get connected to an administrator in the school or to connect with English teachers or art teachers on the faculty. You say, hey, I'm a local cartoonist, I do this sort of thing, how can I help you? Take the conversation from there.
Also, there are some programs that facilitate these kinds of author talks. So, for example, I work with the VLAA, the Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. I believe there's one in every state, at the very least. But essentially, if you have a question about taxes or contracts or copyright, intellectual property, and you're a creator, you can go to the VLAA and they can help you for free. When it comes to taxes, preferably not during tax season because all of the accountants are busy. But usually the VLAA will contact me and say, hey, can you come in and talk? Basically, I will go to a school or a university and I will give them the most basic understanding of contracts, taxes, and IP, and then I would go into what it's like being a working artist. And so it's something that a lot of creators will happily give their time to because most creators want to enrich the industry. They want to keep it growing, because if you're not doing that, where is it going to go?
Rick, you want to add to that?
I'm thinking about what Ben said about creators doing workshops, because I took a lesson that I've been doing in my classroom for years and turned it into a 1-hour workshop that I've done at schools. A lot of districts now will do their own district Comic-Con. And I've done that at a couple of those, one in my own school district, a couple out of town. And I think that is a good way for creators to get their ideas out there, and it's very beneficial to the kids. And speaking of that workshop, I put some handouts in the back because, as all of us said, teachers love handouts. If you're at all curious, it's a little instruction booklet on how to do it. It's a template for how to make a little mini comic and a couple of samples.
I have a weird suggestion, which may seem kind of counterintuitive, I guess, for a lot of creators. A lot of teachers and schools are hesitant about putting comic books in the classroom because they either don't know they have educational value or they've heard that you can see parts of Dr. Manhattan that you probably shouldn't see in other parts of the classroom. The thing is, if you are an award-winning, recognized creator and you do that, people can easily overlook it or look past it. But if you are just starting out trying to get yourself recognized, I don't want to say self-censor, but if there isn't a need for nudity, consider, does it need to be in there? There was a book a while back that I liked. I saw it at a Comic-Con. I was like, oh cool, I put this on my shelf. On the very last page, somebody is opening up a girly magazine, and there's a naked picture in the back that is drawn very tiny, but it's there. And honestly, one of my freshmen finds that, it's going to be the the funniest thing they giggle at all day long, and then I'm going to hear from parents. So I'm not going to put that in my classroom. It was a great book. I would put that in my classroom in a second if it wasn't for that last page. It had nothing to do with the story. It had nothing to do with the content. There was a little bit of language in the book, but people, again, parents don't care about that. All they care about is nudity. I'm not saying censor, but I'm saying that if you are if you are hoping to get noticed eventually, consider that. One of the easiest ways to get an audience is get them while they're young, but if you can't get into the classroom, it's not going to happen.
Also, if you're making your own comics, put page numbers on everything. Because it's really hard to say, go to the page when this and this happened. You can just say, go to page 65.
That's very important for teachers. Hey, by the way, anybody disagree with me on that statement? I brought that up because I feel like it should be controversial, and I don't mind hearing somebody say, well, no, you shouldn't worry about that.
I think you just kind of have to pick your battles for one. If your idea is, I want this to be in the classroom, then yeah, you're going to have to think about that. But if your idea is to put a story out there because you want to tell it, then don't censor yourself and figure out a way for it to get in the classroom. I mean, sometimes I've seen creators point out, this page, and this page has nudity. I recommend putting Post-it notes on them. It actually works very well because teachers will do that. And so I think it just kind of depends on who you are, what you want to do with your book, and what your end goal is. Because if your end goal is to be an educator, then yeah, think about what it's going to be like and where you're trying to go with it. But if you're just making a story, I don't know, make your own story, and the teachers will figure it out.
And not every comic belongs in a high school or middle school classroom, but you can't ignore universities either, right? Like, as we know, there's starting to be more and more traction for comics studies and comics programs, and some things that maybe a parent would have an objection to in a high school classroom. Oh, some daughter's out in college, like, who knows what's there.
Yeah.
So they're different. So.
Speaking of what can be done in a classroom, can you tell us about this?
Oh, sure, briefly, I brought handouts, kind of. This is Collide. I'm just going to pass these around the room, and I'm going to talk very loudly to you, and it's not going to make it. I'll tell you what it is. Collide is a collection of, oh yeah, Kevin will do it, because he's a bench. This is a collection of original student work. We have a comics club on our campus that our district has supported. We've got funding for it. Now kids kind of pay their way to support it, but we have a club that meets on a semi-regular basis where kids create work. We've got a few discrete student-created lessons that are on the page for this talk on the Staple website. A 15-year-old student made some really great lessons on character design and lines of action. You can access those right now. But our club does an activity. They build up a body of work. Our district prints an anthology, and at the end of the year, we go to a major local comics convention in Houston. It's Comic Palooza. The kids table, and they have experience hand-selling comics, talking to creators, taking commissions, and building a body of work they can then start using as the basis for a portfolio for art schools and for future collaborations. So I highly recommend it. If you are interested in getting people excited about comics and involved, consider how you might partner with a local comic shop or school on doing a comics club. And you will have a ton of takers on that. I really believe your students will show up for that.
I actually saw this and was just telling Ben that I was at I was at SPX a few weekends ago, a small press expo in Bethesda, Maryland, and a local school there partners with established writers. I'm talking like Kelly Sue DeConnick and like writers, people who have their stuff on shelves. And their project is to do a short, like 6-page comic with that established writer, and over the semester, that cartoonist, student, will work with them to create the comic. And so they put it into a book, they print it, they sell it at these cons so that they can afford to hire these writers to work with cartoonists, but it's also a great way for people who are just in it because they're like, oh, KSD is in it, of course we're gonna buy it, but also it's a great way to show collaboration, and it gets them to see that, writers that are established are people too, Also, it's really good because there are not really very many standards in the comics industry, unfortunately. When I become president, there will be plenty of standards. But specifically when it comes to comic script, there's no one comic script. So working with several different kinds of writers and artists is really helpful for budding creators, because then they'll be able to, alter the way they work and learn about working and changing their style to make sure that the story gets across, even if the script is not standard.
If you go to Staples' website, where they have the schedule, you can click Comics in the Classroom. There's currently a PowerPoint there that has some stuff that I put up for some other teachers that had asked me, which is just really quick how-tos on making your own comic. I would do these as full lessons and stuff, like I'm sure Ben does, about like character design and that kind of stuff, but there's links to resources there, and I'm going to ask Chris to get the newer version of this up at the end of this weekend. But I do want to point out, well, actually, I was going to kind of exit for a minute, but do we have any questions in the audience about anything before we move on?
You talked about literacy and the concept there, and Steenz was talking particularly about visual literacy, and that reminded me that actually there's a literacy for every form of communication. And everyone knows this, but obviously I'm just one teacher's perspective on the notion that you really do need literacy for everything, including like the internet, and being able to not just read it, but understand it. Is there any real traction on the notion of that in schooling these days?
Yeah, I mean, at least I teach it. But I do think that a lot of people are finally talking about the importance of visual literacy, because it's more than just reading comics. It's everything. Like, for example, if you're in Word and you need to save something, what do you use? You use the floppy disk or the hard drive, or you want to print something, you click on the printer, and then you have the idea of languages within visual literacy, so for example, if you look on the tag of your clothing and it shows the symbols for how to wash it or how to dry clean it, it's just like a triangle with like an X in it, and you're like, I don't know what this means, but that's its own language. Once you have the alphabet for that, then you can read that too. So it's like there's so much more that goes into visual literacy that is more than sequential storytelling, and it's something that I feel like a lot of people should definitely be talking about.
It's like so many of my kids, press button, receive bacon.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can talk about why that's funny.
Yeah.
And then spread that into, we have this whole symbology that you can use as a creative.
Exactly.
On the state level, if we're talking about TEKS, the TEKS essential knowledge and skills are the things that are going to be taught in the classroom and tested on the STAR EOC. And the state's undergoing a revision of that right now. But as far as visual literacy, it's still a very small part of the pie. It's kind of limited to infographics and informational texts. And what we're still catching up is that our students are visually literate because they live on phones and in front of screens. They even speak a shorthand through text communication that looks very different from traditional punctuation. So there's a gap to be bridged. I think comics is an excellent ambassador to help bridge that gap until our state standards, which tend to drag behind some social research anyway, eventually catch up to where we need to be at.
I'm actually teaching a class right now in high school which covers digital literacy and both understanding what you're reading and also behavior that you put online. So that kind of goes with that. Any other questions before we move on? So I wanted to point out real quick, unfortunately we couldn't project it up here on the screen, but we will put it up later. You can find Rick Brooks at mrmorriscomics.com. That's MRMORRIS comics.com. Steenz is at oheysteens on Instagram, Twitter, or Gmail. So it works out. Branding. Ben Humeniuk at benhumeniuk.com. And my name is, my website's very hard to remember. My name is Kevin Garcia, and the website is kevingarcia.com. All the other Kevin Garcias have to go figure something else out for their website. With that, thank you guys very much for coming.